So let me introduce you first to Laurie D. Graham. Apologies on forgetting the middle initial there. She grew up in Treaty 6 territory, which is Sherwood Park, Alberta. Currently lives in Nojawa. Oh boy, this is testing my Indigenous language skills.
Nogojawanong.
Thank you, Nagojinawang. In the territory of the Mississauga Anishinaabe, which is Peterborough, Ontario. I once lived there, go Trent University, where she is a writer, an editor, and the publisher of Brick magazine. Her first book, Row, was shortlisted for the Gerald Lampert Memorial Award for Best First Book of Poetry in Canada. Her second book, Settler Education, was a finalist for Ontario's Trillium Award for Poetry. Her poetry has been shortlisted for the CBC Poetry Prize, won the Thomas Morton Poetry Prize, and appeared in the Best Canadian Poetry Anthology. Laurie's maternal mother comes from around Derwent, Alberta, by way of Ukraine and Poland. And her paternal family comes from around Siemens, Saskatchewan, by way of Northern Ireland and Scotland. She has about a century of history in Canada, which is probably longer than my family's. Oddly enough, we're Delawares. So anyways, without further ado, here's Laurie D. Graham.
Hi, thank you. It's so nice to be back in London. It's nice to see you here. I'm going to read from my new book, Fast Commute, which is a long poem. I'm going to dip into it and dip out of it about 6 or so pages later. It's a book that exists here for stretches. Exists around Kitchener-Waterloo for stretches, takes a lot of trips on the 401, a lot of train trips, looking at Southern Ontario quite a lot as a person who formed into a human being in Alberta, and kind of trying to draw some connections between those two places. I'll start with a part that Josh read out last night at the opening reception. Couple of places he did, so I'll cover those today. We start on the 401. White-tailed deer lifts head from alfalfa, aims satellite ears at 6 lanes of paved artery, humans each alone, dragging goods encased in them. HVAC drones of idling and revving and earth movers in a farmer's field. In a new interminable fog, spring arrived again in winter, swallows feeding on what the machines kick up. Turkey vultures surveying the endless terrestrial Renaults from very high above, the broken-armed maples smothered in vines, coniferous stands salted, browning, Tyvek threaded, the roadkill fledging in long wet grass, the mist thick in each depression. Bedroom windows higher than the sound barrier as they churn more ground to make an on-ramp. As they fill the hole with machines and grid up new rebar, a man pressed between grids working a sparking tool, belly of the earth exposed, outlet mall proliferating on his horizon, creek secreted feet below the road, half sheathed in concrete, given a hard straight course. You could die of exposure in ways you couldn't before. Mechanics/Mohawk Institute, established 1828. Cavalic Hall, Marivel Cowessess School, ended 1997. Your proximity to these first and last. Dufferin, Simcoe, Dundas, King, Queen, Victoria, so I never know where I am and could be anywhere, and this is heritage. A kistka and beeswax and an emptied egg. These grabbed back materials held in worsening sunrise, hand unsteady, the motions familiar, the orange light, smell of wax bringing me closer, at risk of being lost again, wage earning like accelerant, my Toronto cough. Power poles, city blocks, grid layouts, irrigation systems, blasts that burn predictable circles, demo crews promising overnight completion, teetering commodity specs, new continents of waste, the sod over a landfill that makes a mountain range. Billboard nailed to the evangelical church, its parking lot like cooled lava. I do the math staring out a train window as we pass a woman on a defunct track, gazing through us to an instant of peace. Getting to know a river as a cure for loneliness. The river swollen and unapproachable after a season of record rainfall. Pigeon waltzes the trail on one foot and one little nub. Mallards and their escaped domestic kin and the bright, rasping horns of Canada geese in false spring and glacier turquoise water. Hundreds and hundreds of sharps sinking into the banks. Nests of clothes, tents, tarps. Broken trees helped down the slope with chainsaws. Water rainbow slicked. The salt spackled ground. The farmed transplants, the white breadcrumbs. Up the bank, courthouse, hockey arena, brutalist government tower, city museum, wind. Down here, the fork in the river, the sacred. Paint smudge. Shoe prints through a spill of yellow locust leaves. Overhead, the jagged edges of a different leaf, larger, still green. Forgetful of shape, pattern, name, English name, or Latin name, all I do is look at them, passive as television, only reach out my hand when they're ailing or brightly hued. Cars on the overpass, a drum with no beat, just frequency, spraying detritus over the barricades, each stroke presumed individual. The freeway held above the neighborhood like a trophy. Small yellow leaves swarming in side road gusts. Vegetable gardens beside a church, fences around the dyed back. Landscape fabric and stained mulch, the grass saturated, the grass torn away along the artery, dandelion, clover, marigold reflowering in approaching frost. The slough we pass on the way to the liquor store. A juniper gray with berries, flashing with wax wings. A rush of wind through squat maple as the temperature drops swiftly. All the while, engines along the raised vein. Walking the sidewalks of an old suburb I do not know, Googling how to make pesan kadai out of all these black walnuts, sidewalks on one side of the street, a childhood jack-o'-lantern neighborhood, the clouds frightening and rapid, low and sudden, tall branches whipping, cars profuse along the thoroughfare, a drone that forms in the south maybe, the on-ramps, how the ear must have it start somewhere, behind structures of cinder block. Behind exploding scarlet Virginia creeper, exploding terrier on a rope in a yard, no beginning or ceasing, the wildness right up to the wall with its shitty graffiti and holes cut for fire hoses at points blanked out by the flashing sides of trucks. The angles of the roofs, the rain barrels, flower beds, fertilizer spreaders, these versions of where I come from. Knowledge of home in danger of becoming academic. An empty can of energy drink under a sugar maple. A black squirrel crossing critical thresholds, road wall, green strip, chain link, trail, wooden fence, property. Ubiquity of Tim's cups. Buckthorn, creeper. Confetti of locust leaves reanimated by SUVs through the subdivision. The bright yellow mush trails to nothing as the rain picks up again, falls sideways. Thank you.
I had to build the tension by not saying anything for a second there. But thank you, Laurie. That was absolutely wonderful. We'll talk about it in a minute because I think that's the best way to do it. So let's introduce Madhur Anand. She is the author of the experimental memoir, This Red Line Goes Straight to Your Heart, winner of the Governor General's Literary Award for Nonfiction, the poetry collection A New Index for Predicting Catastrophes, and several other literary works published in national and international literary magazines. She is a professor of ecology and sustainability at the University of Guelph, where she was appointed to the inaugural director of the Guelph Institute for Environmental Research. Thank you for books, back covers. Madhur, take it away.
Hello. Is this on? Good. Yes, this is my second book of poems. It originated about 7 years ago with two sets of things, two sort of origin points. One was the discovery of this book entitled The Nests and Eggs of Indian Birds, which happened to be a 19th century collection of observations of the nests and eggs of Indian birds, arranged by species and written in a very Victorian style by people who, collected the birds for making skins, putting them into museum collections, collecting the eggs, collecting the nests, of course, killing the birds and so on. But it was this very strange text. And also, starting to confront the mortality of my parents. I just learned recently, actually, the term ambiguous grief, which I'll share with you because it's very expensive for me to learn that term, and you're getting it for free. And it's when you grieve something that is not quite complete, not quite terminated, not quite finished, like somebody who is entering into a phase of illness, a rapid decline, or frankly, like the climate emergency and biodiversity decline that we're all, collectively mourning, I think, whether we know it or not. So, so it was those two things that finally, after 7 years, I don't know if they eclipsed, but they're entangled in this book. Also, I'm a scientist, and for some reason, I put the three hardest, most scientific diagrams at the very beginning of the book. So don't be scared if you look at it over there and just look at the first poem and just say, "Oh my God, forget it," or you see a scientific diagram. Just skip over the first three. Just skip the first section, and just skip it, and you can go back to it later. So I'm going to start by reading you a poem entitled "Mother Says I Talk Like a Son." S-O-N. All her life, my mother shunned pets until now. Maybe because her right foot is less connected to her left brain since the stroke. It leaves her pervious to thunder, lightning, cats. She says move, but nothing moves. It was never one thing, then two, with my mother. It was a third thing, igniting like rain on a wedding day, predicting nothing but more rain for all a bride's life. Now, out of the blue Guelph sky, my mother says, if you must have a pet, make it a parrot. They can talk. She tells me her every last dream and each dream's interpretation, both permeable as long-term weather forecasts. For all her life, my mother lived in someone else's dreams, like pending rain. It's bad. She's at a wedding. She sees the bride's face, who should never be seen like that, without a veil. The clouds part, and my mother is in post-partition Dehradun, is 8 and playing with the landlord's daughter, whose name she can't recall. Their pet, a female parrot named Butchie, is whose call she hears now. Aja Bacha, she repeats. Come, child. Ungendered. Okay, I will read you one poem. It is entitled Mind Compression, and it's a found poem from a scientific article. I do that sometimes, and you know, we'll see if anybody in the room can guess which article or which scientist. Trivia. We talked about trivia. Which scientist this poem, the article from which this poem was found, comes from. And what I mean by found is that I scanned the article, looked for words that were interesting to me. In no way does the poem try to summarize or encapsulate the scientific article, although there is an eerie connection. So the words occur like not in the order of that they appear in the scientific article, right? Mind compression. Every line of thought is an oscillation we must enter into arbitrarily. Only this small amount of work in a vacuum, and it all makes sense. We are bound to equating contradictions of experience with experience. When a resonator tries to communicate, we should talk about it, write about it. That famous incident of the train, a collision with the ponderable. The very special cases, they are present-day energy. They are light itself. No, not that. Who's the scientist? Any guesses? It's pretty obvious, actually. Huh? Close.
First guess was Edison.
Same first initial. There we go.
The winner was Einstein, for those at home.
You knew?
No, I'm just telling them so they know online.
Oh, Einstein, I'm sorry, yes. For those following. On a heuristic point of view about the creation and conservation of light, published in 1905. Bravo. Bravo. Okay. Let's see. Pardon? Put the mic to my face. All right. This poem is entitled Amplification. And so, you know, over those 7 years, as I was reading The Nests and Eggs of Indian Birds, you know, thinking about various things with my parents and origins, I also was obviously doing so many other things like listening to the news. And so sometimes, so this poem has some couplets at the end of the stanzas that are text taken from a news article that was written to express the fact that the Natural History Museum in New Delhi a few years ago just went up in flames and completely burnt down, and all the specimens that had been collected in it over, I don't know, a century, were just destroyed. And I think you'll be able to tell what lines are taken. They're in italics in the poem, but you'll see, I think. Amplification. I've been reading about lines. The Radcliffe line, the line of control, the line of best fit, plays, novels, memoirs, drawing the line, the crooked line, fault lines, a professor of sociology's book, The Fine Line. What can I say? I've gathered so much moss and dried grass now. All my nests are lined, but all my baskets are empty. 20 years ago, a young man who claimed to be my soulmate gave me The Art of Loving, the author of which claimed, love is a verb. It's not. Neither is it an art. Love can only be a noun, as in the wooden partitions to separate different wings of the museum on each of the 4 floors fed the fire. I never did read The Art of Loving, but I know the 64 arts of the Kama Sutra. There are 4 I still want to master. Knowledge of minds, teaching parrots or starlings to talk, tying turbans, making a bed. Love can be an adjective, but only when used as a noun, as in, the specimens, the stuffed animals, and the chemicals some specimens were preserved in were all highly combustible. I know it doesn't count for anything that I once tried kissing my soulmate, because he was the kind of irresistible man my sister said she would make out with I just somehow the image of that sorry, my sister doesn't even know she's in this poem. Irresistible man my sister said she would make out with if he entered an elevator, randomly. Valuable exhibits, including stuffed animals of endangered species, were on the first floor, but the fire started higher up. Okay, another thing I did in this book was I went to visit the specimens of those birds, those nests and eggs of Indian birds. The birds still exist in museum specimens around the world. I went to England, where the majority of them are now. They were collected by someone named Alan Octavian Hume and a number of his people. And so most of them are there. Some of them are in New York. There's a few in the ROM. There's a few in different parts of the world. And I went to 3 of those museums to look at them and photograph them. And I got, okay, so we're going to do one little thing. Do you have the book? Oh, I'll do it. I think I can do it. Maybe, no, I'll do it. I'm going to do this thing. So in the book, I have photographs that I took of those birds, those skins. They're dead and they're stuffed and they're, they're in these drawers in the museum. But I present them to you as visual poems, and I superimposed on them QR codes of, you'll see where they go. If you have the book, you can try it with your phone. It's like page 77, I'm going to.
Even at home, you can do this.
Oh,
so if you're at home, you can, page 77.
It's safe to do at home. Just takes a second, though. Just because
This tells you how cool this book is, right? It's definitely very interactive.
Yeah. Hard to do with one hand. Okay. So I've just, this is page 77. Oh, sorry.
They won't leave now.
That's the white-throated laughing thrush, an Indian bird species. I will end with one more poem. It's entitled Two-Part Organ, or Returning to Cardinal. Today my consonants are mere control of airflow. Only my vowels are sung. When I first write two-toned, I mean red or not red, male or female, but now I know more. That the root of cardinal is hinge, that the square root is of no use, only squared bifurcation of bronchi, flips between vibrating columns and noise, oscillations doubling, bass and treble right, and hope as the probability of synchrony left. I see light couple and decouple, beat wings at wrong frequencies, fly into a bush, orchestrate landings. The syrinx and the larynx found at a junction. I want those colorless feathers, her colorless lips.
Just wonderful. Thank you for those two readings. So I've been spending a lot of my summer reading both of these titles, actually, which seems very appropriate. And like when I more and more I think back upon it, so just to hear them performed again, just adds that certain element that I always love, and that's very thankful for all the audience here to be engaged in that way. But let's start with some questions, right? We want to have a conversation. We're a bunch of poets up here. We should have a conversation. So, like I said, these are both Laurie and Madhur's work has been books that have completely grabbed my attention this year because they're operating in maybe a new, not necessarily new, but it's sort of an expanding kind of arc in poetry. And this is the conversations I've often been having because a lot of new folks that are coming to talk to me about work or places I've been lecturing have been talking about science and the arts mixing. And I think that both these books offer us that aspect, right? There's a different underpinning to what's going on in both collections here and both of their works. We call it eco-poetics often, but I think it's beyond that in a sense. So when and this is just to help frame some of what we're going to be talking about. So when I first approached Laurie's work, it definitely struck me as it's in the same vein as Randy Lundy, the great Cree writer from out west, and Randy operates in much the same way that Gary Snyder does. Poets of the land, they're poets of movement, but are profoundly personal. So there's something that I found as a great touchstone in there. And Madhur's work really is reminiscent to me of and hopefully she doesn't get embarrassed when I say this, Seamus Heaney and Paul Muldoon. These are poets who deal with a sort of a grand political crisis or social crisis, something that brought them away from their homelands in some sense, but is fundamentally tied to the nature of their lands. So I want to start with a discussion on movement, because movement appears in very different ways in both of your collections. So Laurie, maybe we'll start with you. How does motion and movement in your poetry, how do you find that?
Movement. This book is about movement in a lot of ways. The one idea that the book is revolving around at length is understanding how movement has been framed as a way to not dig into a place. As a way to kind of skitter along the surface without being able to really dig in. And the whole goal of the book is to look closely out the train window or the bus window to really turn your attention to the thing that we see as the useless verges where nothing goes on. To really look at the weeds coming up in the ditch, or to look at sort of the inventory of roadkill that's on the side of the highway. Really to take the attention on the things that we try not to pay attention to as we move between the points, the A to B points where we're trying to go. So movement for this book is really one of its subjects, one of its themes. But the form of the long poem is the other thing that comes to mind when you talk about movement, and just how the book vacillates or modulates between its forms, how it continues on its idea and moves from a beginning to a middle to an end. I don't know how well I can describe exactly what's happening in there, but I was very keenly attentive to the idea of movement of the line and the movement of the stanza through this work.
I definitely feel the movement. If you haven't read the book, please read the book. Buy it now. Buy 5 copies. Give it away to your friends.
I agree.
But if you read the book, it's a long form poem, and I find that the cadence and even the way that it's laid out on the page really speaks to a very Ontario thing or a very Canadian thing of being in the car or being in a train. So there's these snippets, because you look out, like right now, I'm looking out the window, I'm like, oh, there goes some pigeons. Then I'm back over here, and I look back 3 minutes, and there's some fluff going. And I think that's that movement is very natural, and very, very much so grabs my attention. Madhur.
Yeah, I think the thing that came to mind with that question was the actual movement of the oscillation that occurs in our larynx and the birds. In the birds, it's called the syrinx, and they're very different organs. I mean, they have the same function, right, to create song, voice for humans. But anyway, voice actually occurs a little bit through other things, but it does originate in the larynx or the syrinx, and I only realized this through studying birds, which, by the way, I really did not know anything about before starting to write this book, because although I'm an ecologist, I don't study birds. I knew nothing about birds, but now I know a lot more through poetry. And yeah, so what I learned was that, well, we all know that sound is produced is waves, right? That's a movement, that's an oscillation. But I was just so fascinated to learn about I went to the extent of looking at mathematical models of that movement to see how it happens, because, it's a very simple origin, a very simple mechanism, and also really simple models, but, they produce all of everything, right? All of human song, all of poetry, all of song, all of bird song, and we know how diverse that can be, right? So so I'm interested in that, in those types of movements. There's also, like I was trying to explain a little bit earlier, the movement of birds, and of objects and of people, and how they're interconnected. So going from thinking about those colonial collections of Hume in the 19th century, and those birds moving from India and our surroundings to live birds moving to museum collections that are that we don't see, and they're sort of stored there, and then those museum collections even move, and there's this ongoing diaspora of movement of organisms, and there's a lot of complexities around that movement as well, if we think about, and we're starting to think about that more, right, in the scientific world, about how science our scientific knowledge and even our specimens upon which we build our knowledge in museums. Oh, we're in a museum, you know, are so dependent on those colonial movements, yeah, we're just starting to just understand all of that. What else? I mean, yeah, I'll stop there for now. Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, you could almost say that nowadays we are a people that are constantly in motion. So regardless, when we look at both titles here, we're moving, not just necessarily in a car or a train, but we're moving psychologically around things. And I think you're both really handle. Campbell McGrath, the great American poet, calls it lyric consciousness. And I'd say the work here is very strong with the lyric consciousness. But there's something that's fascinating me, because we have one book, Laurie's book, which is one long poem. And we were talking about long and short poems before we came in here. So I'm curious, and obviously so much of what we're talking about is the sort of changing world. Like, we are living in this moment of existential dread, right? We know that things aren't going so well. It's 70-something degrees outside today. That was my Windsor problem. I just set it in Fahrenheit. But we'll start with Madhur. I want to consider what long form versus short form poetry. So long verse versus short verse. So, you know, like the big epic poems. Which one do you find is more comfortable to work in right now, with knowing that things are changing and we're having to respond to that and adding that consciousness and movement stuff? That's a big question. Let's see what you can do.
Both, because there are both short poems and long poems. There's one really, really long poem in my book. It's the last section. It's entitled "Slow Dance," and I've never ever written a long poem before, so I don't, you know. I don't know. It's kind of a long story. Like, everything is it's a very long story, but basically short poem, long, basically that's the thing, right? Like, I just think, okay. Short, long. I don't know. I don't know. I don't actually think there's any quantitative or even qualitative difference between, you know, the length of to consider the length of a poem. I mean, I don't know really anything about poetics, to be honest.
She says that, and you should read the book, and then you'll be.
You know, I mean, I've never studied form in poetry. I mean, I've just taught it to myself. But, like, you know, let's see what I. Okay. Laurie, would you like to speak to this, since your whole book is a long poem?
Hey, why not?
I'll come back to it, maybe.
Yeah, well, yeah, I don't know if there's a form for our age. I think there's likely should be not a form for our age, but many forms. But I have seen in other people's works and discerned in my own work that the fragment seems to carry some sort of particular meaning right now, which you could read into that various things. But for my own tendency towards the longer form, it has to do with just revolving myself around a really large, to the point of nearly crushing idea, and needing to sort it out and to do it sprawlingly. I often will start thinking I'm writing a svelte little one-pager, but it never kind of turns out that way, because it seems that I would be kind of the equivalent of a novel writer, but I'm working in this form. So I don't know. Does that help you get somewhere, Madhur?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. You know, I mean, I don't know about the svelte.
Yeah.
Because I hear you though. The one-pagers are sort of.
I'd argue that yours are, in a way, the way you deal in the found form. You're kind of
It's longer than it appears.
right.
That's what I was gonna I was trying to say. It's longer than it appears, right?
Yeah, I like that.
These shorter ones, these short ones. But yeah, I guess, I kind of try to pack in things like, space is basically, and time too, are basically fractal. So
I like that.
that basically, I think destroys any sort of idea of like, long and short, because you can pack in, everything, like you can pack in everything into one page, or you can, so I think there is like, registers, layers, depth, density, language. There's so many like things that poets use, right? To and perhaps, but overall, I would say it's not the length, it's not the line length, it's not the number of lines, right? It's just not quantitative that way. It just doesn't. So, yeah, I would just suggest to read the poems. Just not even think of that, honestly, and at all.
Thank you. No, that was a good. I mean, I put you on the spot with that one. I know that I'm always, as a poet myself, I oscillate back and forth between wanting to. Who doesn't want to write the great epic again,
I
right?
can tell you how the long poem came to be because it is really long.
You should
but
do that, yeah.
I don't know if that's so interesting. Like you should probably read the poem first. But you have, so I'll tell you, and then they can just listen.
Just listen along, okay? She's going to tell me.
The last poem was written after the book was finished. I thought the book was finished. I had submitted it to my publisher, and more or less, right? It's more or less finished by that point. But then came the pandemic, and so maybe we'll have an answer here. And then I did the process of revision in the pandemic. Did you too? Did you too? You didn't revise? Because our books came out at the same time, right? Yeah. You didn't have much. Yeah, I didn't have much revision, but I was sitting with the unfinished book. And then the pandemic hit, and I went to do a residency at the Alperty A-frame, and there's like isolation, self-isolation within self-isolation, which was just really wild, talking about fractals. And somehow when you go to residency, you sort of feel like you have to write some things, and I didn't, and I thought the book was finished, so that was a big thing. By the time I went, the book was already finished. But I had said that I was going to work on this book, so I did start to make observations and write little diary entries, and then when it came time to, I don't know, like send in the final version, I started to collect those diary entries, and they sort of started to accumulate into a kind of more meditative mode, and then I realized that the form that the subjects, the topics, the things I was thinking about and writing about, birds of course, but many other things, started to remind me of a poem, a long poem that I had read many, many, many years ago in my formative, very formative period of becoming a poet, which was John Ashbery's long poem, Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror. And then when I started to remember that poem and then also realize what I was doing, I then kind of modeled my poem on his poem, so it has exactly the same number of, like this, it has the same stanza structure, and I actually borrowed some lines from him and stuck them in, and so it's after his poem.
Wonderful. Okay, I have one really important question, and we've all spent time at the A-frame, Purdy's A-frame, and I've been. We're all A-frame Ameliasburg alumni. So, and this is a question. It's something that sort of haunted me when I was up there. I was there in April and May of this year, and fundamentally start thinking about how all of us as poets and writers are going to approach this idea of reconciliation and decolonization. You can't have an indigenous poet up here and not have this kind of question, right? Um, and when I thought of, I started thinking about this while I'm up there, and I realized why I liked Al Purdy. Al Purdy was, by the way, the first Canadian poet that I was like, yeah, I can get behind that. And the reason being, I think, was that connection to the land. There's this idea of something that's not connected to this sort of colonial individualism, I guess is the best way to put it. And when I read both of your works, this really sort of resonated with me. That's why I really enjoyed coming to them. And perhaps that might deal with the sort of more scientific, the more ecologically based methods by which, not necessarily, because I mean, many of the individual poems in the pieces or full-length poems deal with the person, your very unique experiences in the world. But yet the metaphors, the controlling concrete aspects of your work speak to a shared environment, a shared both global and both Canadian environment. So how do you envision these sort of eco-poetics, for lack of a better word, the work that both of you have undertaken as poets, that even Al did initially as a poet? Well, not initially. His first poems were terrible. Don't read his early poetry. But how do you see that as contributing to decolonization and reconciliation?
Yeah, that's an enormous question that I don't know the answer to entirely. But I take as one of my goals when I'm writing any sort of poetry is as a settler, as a white settler on this continent, I'm pretty consistently writing towards or trying to seed a way of living that isn't so relentlessly extractive, that isn't a blight on the life that is here and the people whose land this is. So, like, the short answer to your question is like I can only just speak about my work in response and say I'm trying to really like move things. Like I have like perhaps impossibly lofty goals, you know, but I think that might be what it is. It's just poets taking the time to reckon with that and to do that together and together to kind of change the course of the river as it's going right now.
Almost like a testimony, right? We're testifying in a way.
A little bit.
And that's important. A lot of Indigenous cultures, especially in Ape, we have a big thing. We testify at the big house every year. Thank you for that, though. Madhur?
Well, for the decolonial part, I do feel that this book is an act of decolonization, I guess, as I understand it. But in terms of the reconciliation part with respect to our Indigenous history here in Canada, I'm not sure, but I don't know. I kind of curious what you have to say about this, because I mean, what I learn and things that I have found resonating with the work that I try to do when I work between the arts and the sciences, and with what discussions I have with my colleagues who are Indigenous or are working within Indigenous groups. And also, I do actually do some work with some Indigenous groups in India as well. Is this idea that there is no division there, you know, and it's one of the few places where I encounter that. And I sometimes I'll present this work in a venue, and then you know, I'll speak with an Indigenous artist who happens to be there, and they'll say, well, you know, we don't distinguish between art and science. We don't, you know, and I'm like, yeah, me too, you know. And so, you know, there's that aspect of it that I feel like there's an overlap. I don't know that I'm, enacting that, but there's an overlap in that approach. I think there's a sort of analogy with two-eyed seeing, but I'm not sure. Like maybe you could tell me if you see that.
Well, I think you definitely are breaking down the borders between that sort of hard sciences and the arts. But there's something else that you're doing, and this is a really important thing for this week. We just came out of Treaty Week, where we talk about treaty, and treaty is a relationship. And I think both of your works are definitely dealing with that sort of treaty that we all have with creation. So using that as your basis is actually, I mean, I think about Randy Lundy's work, who I'm going to go to frequently, but that you're really sort of reinforcing that treaty and being able to talk about it. Now, obviously, Madhur, your book breaks down a lot more barriers because and that's not to be derogatory to any other books, but you have the bird songs that you can scan. There's diagrams. It's doing this work that's breaking down that hard categorization of these colonialisms. So I do want to give a moment for any questions in the audience. Oh, we do have one in the back. Yes. Okay, so I'm just going to repeat the question. So apologies, because we do have people online. So the question goes back to the short versus long poem. Basically, how do you know when the poem's done? Is it just short? Is it long? Does that kind of cover? Yeah. Thank you.
In short, I don't know. I honestly cannot be sure when the poem is done. I am the sort of person who will make little pencil marks in the published book when I realize there's other words that need to be said. And so I'm reading a new version of the same poem when I read it in live. So for me, I could tinker and tinker, but there is something about the poem that you're writing at the time that you're writing it, and sometimes you're out of it. You know that that was for that time, and now it's over, and now like that's about as close as I can get to it. I kind of know when I've put it down, but a lot of times I can see well how this thing could continue, but have to resist is more like it. I have to resist continuing.
I will add to one thing. The great American poet Richard Hugo, in his book Triggering Town, said every poet keeps writing the same poem over and over again. So I find that's true. So keep writing just until you get it right. I think we're running low on time here, but maybe one more question? Yeah, we're running. I think we've gone over. Uh-oh, overtime. Any other questions from the audience? Don't be afraid. Do you want to make her make bird calls? Okay, now is the interpretive dance part of the evening. No.
There's one from Penn.
Question? Penn? For the people at home, question was lyric consciousness, and what does that mean for you as writers?
Oh, it's everything. really. I mean, I think the reason I became a poet was because of the existence of lyric consciousness. Like, I didn't even know that that was a thing. And when I discovered it, and for me, what it was I discovered it through reading. Well, first of all, I mean, yeah, I mostly discovered it from reading before I could see it in my own work. And it was, I mean, I don't really know what the term means, to be honest, but for me, what happens when I read poetry of, you know, certain poems, when it has a certain effect on me, when it makes this kind of connection in my mind, a new thought, a new feeling, and you know, it evokes an image, like those very basic things that poetry does is to me, you know, lyric consciousness and discovery, you know. So I feel that I am discovering something when reading a poem, and it blows my mind whenever it happens, right? So, and that can only happen in a poem. Like, it's not the same kind of discovery that you can get from other means. And so I'm always then out, you know, trying to find ways of that happening for me. But then when you write a poem, you want that also hopefully to happen for others as well, right? So I think that it's very powerful, the lyric consciousness. There are things that can be, I don't know how it works exactly, but I think it's very powerful what we can receive from poetry.
I'll try to be brief, but I think of what Robin Wall Kimmerer wrote in Braiding Sweetgrass, Grass, saying that humans have a unique capacity to give thanks. That's rather what our job is as humans, is to give thanks. And then I also think of Tim Lilburn describing the process of how words form on the page into poems. How you look, I can't stop like looking out the window while I'm here today, and just the idea of looking at a thing and wanting to respond in our human way, and doing that with language. And so for me, lyric consciousness exists very close to those two ideas, just the need and the will to give thanks.
Those were some great responses. Thank you. Just as a side note, I want to know that these two books, when I often speak of lyric consciousness, it's the way that the poems are living, breathing beings on the page. And when I read your books, I feel like I'm sharing space with you. I'm holding space in a way that is so profoundly personal, but also this sort of collective experience. So it's like I'm on the Via train coming down from Toronto all the way to Windsor, or I'm in the classrooms with you. I'm in a comfortable space where you're telling me the stories and playing me the bird songs and showing me the images. And I think that, you know, the great poems, the great poets do this so well. And if you want to know how it's working, grab some copies. And they will affix their signatures beside the title page, and you can enjoy that lyric consciousness. So I think we're probably going a little over today, because I'm still staring out the window and smiling because it's sunny. And I'm thinking about the line, dream like pending rain. That's kind of where we are right now. So I want to thank both Laurie and Madhur for such a great reading and a great talk today. And thanks for Words London. I mean, what an awesome time to be back and sharing space with you in this beautiful museum in this beautiful city at the most sacred forks of the Deshkan Zibi, or Shemu Sipi if you're Lenape. It is a real gift to have shared time with you. And just thank you. A big round of applause for our readers today. And both authors will be available to sign their books up at the top, or down here, or go outside, they'll get blown away. Enjoy the rest of Words, London. Thank you.